We're going to go back to the work of the day. We are going to begin our afternoon session with a talk from Candy Green. Candy Green, it works in the Energy Producer Country Affairs Division of the Office of International Energy Policy at the U.S. Department of State, and she was intricately involved in the first two U.S.-Russia Commercial Energy Summit meetings, and she's going to talk to us a little bit today about U.S.-Russian energy relations.
Thank you. It's nice to see some familiar faces around the room. And I'm honored to be invited back here again today to discuss the U.S.-Russia energy dialogue and our cooperation in such impressive and thoughtful company. However, I must say before getting underway that being given the dreaded first post-lunch speaker spot gave me some pause. Was a U.S. government speaker expected to be so sleep-inducing that this period was a natural? Or did Amy's worldwide connections give her access to the closely held information that my closing remarks would include insider tips on which Russian greenfield is going to be the next Kashagan? Well, now that you're going to actually pay attention to what I have to say, I want to bring you up to date on our energy dialogue with Russia. Like many others, I'm struck by the coincidence of being here today on the anniversary of Khodorkovsky's arrest. Of course, we have heard that there are no coincidences, so we may draw some conclusions from that. It's also the one-year anniversary of the time that I was last here to brief you on the U.S.-Russia energy relationship. A lot has happened in that year. But I remember Martha saying then, as she did again today, that as she reviewed the signposts leading up to that day, his arrest seemed, in hindsight, somehow inevitable. And as 1 year has passed with the Yukos case dominating the headlines, fulfillment of the Kremlin's apparent intent to reacquire a measure of control over the energy sector also somehow seems inevitable. But what does that mean to our bilateral energy dialogue, to Russia's larger economic picture, and to the geopolitics entangled therein? From our perspective, the U.S.-Russia energy dialogue remains a priority for both our governments and offers a forum for developing a promising area of continuing mutual interest. We've welcomed the contribution Russia's steadily increasing oil production has made to the stability of global energy supplies, particularly in a year marked by strikes and sporadic disruptions. Without the steadiness of Russian export flows, many of our allies and friends would have been worse off, and non-OPEC energy production growth would look much less promising for the future. At the government-to-government level, our bilateral cooperation continues to grow. There was an informal meeting of the U.S.-Russia Energy Working Group in Washington October 7th, in which I participated, and at which the two sides agreed, among other things, on expanding cooperation in the areas of energy efficiency and information exchange. We also agreed to continue conducting joint workshops, focusing on specific issues, with the next ones coming up to look at differentiated taxation and LNG financing options. 2 workshops on oil spill prevention and response have already been held, the second in Norway this past spring. And we also agreed on October 7th to continue cooperative work in that area. Beyond that, continuing high-level contacts on and discussion of energy issues outside the more formal energy dialogue framework have given both our governments a deeper understanding of each side's objectives and constraints, an understanding which will surely yield additional dividends in the future. However, you, like many others, may still ask, where's the beef? Frankly, growth of commercial energy cooperative projects has been slower than we would have liked. Today, we've certainly, all of us here, heard a lot of reasons that might explain some of that. And we both would like to see more concrete commercial cooperation precede a third commercial energy summit. True, there have been recent positive steps. One example is the ConocoPhillips purchase of a 7.6% stake in Lukoil. Another is the Memorandum of Understanding signed between Gazprom and Chevron Texaco to pursue joint LNG projects. Also, international joint ventures in Sakhalin blocks are expanding, apart, of course, from Sakhalin-3. The commercial energy dialogue continues because we know our companies remain strongly interested in participating in the Russian energy sector despite the occasional difficulties of doing business there. And we want to do everything possible to support that interest constructively. But there have been disappointing developments as well. The Russian government's decision to retender Sakhalin-3 represents one of those setbacks, something we've made clear to our Russian counterparts. It is, of course, not just the immediate loss of a project that's the concern, but also what this action may signal in the broader context about respect for contract sanctity. Russian foot-dragging on expansion of the Caspian Pipeline Consortium project, the CPC, has been another disappointment. But we are hopeful that the way ahead, which was agreed at the meeting last July between the Russian government and CPC shareholders, will lead to a balanced solution. And of course, there is Yukos. We have told the Russian government that this case is a barometer of Russia's respect for the rule of law, transparency, and a fair and open climate for investors. A solution that appears to be a stripping of assets or a sale of assets at less than fair market value will undermine Russia's reputation as a place to do business and will affect Russia's standing in international capital and investment markets. Of course, also, it will have an impact on its reputation in the area of the rule of law. Recent reports out of Russia make us concerned about the possibility that the Russian government will sell off part or all of Lugansk Naftogaz at a price far below its appraised value. We continue to urge a fair, open, and transparent solution to the government's tax dispute with Yukos. So where to next? With several actions in the past year demonstrating Kremlin intent to tighten state control over energy resources, is there still really room for growing bilateral commercial cooperation? Is there a point to continuing this energy dialogue? Our government would answer that with a resounding yes, and I believe the Russian government would do the same. We understand that energy policy is evolving inside Russia, that our goals may not always align perfectly, and that governments consider many factors when formulating policy. But that does not mean that both sides cannot gain further from our continuing cooperation. And collective global energy security and economic stability can also benefit. Perhaps matured and realistic are the appropriate adjectives to use to describe expectations today. We will continue to encourage the government of Russia to take the kinds of steps that will help make its production and export growth sustainable in the mid to long term. These include expanding export pipeline capacity, welcoming foreign investment, strengthening corporate governance and the legal and regulatory framework for business, developing a tax and legal framework to encourage risk-taking investment in the greenfields and frontier regions, further demonopolization and privatization. Such moves would make a major contribution towards improving the vibrancy and diversity of Russia's own economy, as well as the diversity of the global energy supply mix. In other words, we see them as win-wins. For now, we are devoting time and energy to helping Russia build the regulatory, tax, and fiscal foundation necessary for a mature international global energy player. We are doing this through things like the very practical workshops on tax, oil spill prevention, LNG, and the like that I described, and that are about show, not tell. Our mutual interests are served when Russia enhances the diversification of energy sources around the globe. Russia's a big player, clearly, and can become an even bigger player, and we would welcome that. But at the same time, we recognize that the Russian government has priorities that don't always align with ours. So our encouragement is not about haranguing, but rather about supporting what we think are the overarching goals where our objectives can meet comfortably. We raise our concerns as a friend, as a partner who would like to see Russia succeed on all fronts. For example, the Russian government may not want to maximize short-term production growth or to allow unfettered international investment and access to its gas and oil reserves. However, the government does likely recognize that achieving predictable and reliable production growth remains a key component in its efforts toward economic diversification and growth. Our bilateral cooperation can help that happen. Also, the Russian government's idea of what constitutes acceptable rules of the game in their oil and gas sector is likely different from our own. But through commercial involvement with U.S. and other international companies in concrete projects, different standards of corporate governance and transparency can be modeled and disseminated. Of course, there are many other examples along these lines, but the most important factor is that both of our presidents are committed to continuing this dialogue and finding ways to enhance our energy cooperation. And it's not just about energy security. Our government believes a robust bilateral economic relationship should provide the foundation and even serve as a shock absorber for the wider U.S.-Russian relationship, creating economic ties that endure despite inevitable political differences. We recognize that it is very much in the U.S.'s, and indeed everyone's interest, to encourage and assist in realizing the goal of a thriving, successful Russia. To do that, more needs to be done to enhance Russia's investment climate and diversify its economy away from natural resources. Russia does need to strengthen and consolidate its democracy. There remains some concern that a weakening of its democratic institutions could undermine Russia's ability to realize its full potential. Failure to confront these issues could also inhibit the U.S.-Russian relationship from developing in the ways that we all want to see. But Russia, of course, will decide its own future, its own system of government, its own democratic path. And where we can help, we certainly will. Thank you. Would you like questions now, Amy? Or okay. Any questions? That boring, huh? Oh, Bob?
Have you found it difficult to figure out who it is you should be talking to in Moscow?
Everybody? Is that too broad?
I understand that has been a problem for our government. Who do you talk to?
No, I understand the question. I think it's not exactly clear what weight different players will have as the new administration continues to really shake out and the energy ministry has been reshuffled. I think there's recognition that there are players from a number of different angles, whether that's the tax ministry with the own role, the tax authorities with the role that they play, Minister Kudrin, Kristenko and the new expanded ministry, which clearly the Kremlin is playing a larger role. And so I think there's certainly recognition on our part that there are a number of different people and institutions that are influencing the way energy policy is developing.
Just a quick question. I know that some government officials have talked with the Russian government specifically about Sakhalin-3. I remember that I think somebody from the Commerce Department was in Russia a few months ago on that. Can you shed any light on what has happened with that situation and what the government has said in response, the Russian government has said in response to concerns with that?
The Russian government, as far as we understand it, still intends to proceed with retendering Sakhalin-3.
What did they tell you about?
That they still intend to proceed with retendering. There hasn't been, I'm not sure what you're looking for, but that's the intent continues despite the comments that have been made.
Do you think in that context it's completely impossible to think of Exxon or any US company retendering in the way that you've seen, for instance, at Saline, when they said no more PSA at Saline? Shell went in and agreed to do, after a long period of negotiation, to do it under tax and royalty terms instead, which it was all presented not as a climb down in any way. It was done very cleverly. But do you think, I mean, the fact is that there is a change in the way the upstream is being offered in Russia, because the international terms are different. People really want Russia desperately now, as before they could go somewhere else.
So is your question...
My question is, would it be unthinkable, maybe not for Exxon, but for a US company to go back to the table and try and get Sakhalin-3? I mean, they want foreign investment in Sakhalin, undoubtedly.
Okay. So is it unthinkable that the Russian government would allow, or that American companies would come back and participate in that new tender? No, I don't think it's unthinkable. I think I think that companies are interested.
Yeah.
Certainly have heard that through our contacts with people, even in that, whether they'll be allowed to, but I think they're certainly interested.
Do you think there will be a restated national energy policy report anytime soon in the United States?
Do you mean, would we be reissuing a new, something that
No,
came out like
please.
what came in the original, the beginning of this administration?
Yeah, 2001 National Energy Policy Report, whether under any administration there are chances there will be an updated version of it or something.
Well, I think maybe on November 3rd you would ask me that question again.
I'll send you an email.
Is there any third energy summit with Russia planned or scheduled at all, or is that just something on the horizon eventually?
I think the comment that I made in here that we'd both like to see more concrete commercial projects first
Yeah, that's
would
that.
allude to that. Yeah, there's not a specific date on the drawing board.
How would you translate the UCOS type risk to a foreign company investing in Russia? Presumably if you pay your taxes and don't have political aspirations, things will be different, or the risk profile would be different. How do you rationalize that for new entrants?
I wouldn't like to be in the job of having to rationalize that myself, but I have heard a number of companies say that as they look at this, that they see UCOS, these are foreign companies, that they look at UCOS as a one-off. Whether that's optimistic, whether it's realistic, I think time will tell. But I think the way the companies are looking at this is that, as we've heard a lot today, there was a lot of there were a lot of factors that came together to make that case happen the way that it did. And I think they're hoping that that was going to be an isolated circumstance in terms of the developments that have come forward. But I think we've also heard a lot today, and we've seen a lot of demonstration of Kremlin interest in having a greater degree of control over the energy sector. And so I think companies are looking at, and I think probably Russian companies at this as well, the key is to understanding what the rules of the game are now. And I think there remains some uncertainty about that. Certainly, I think Russian companies have been trying to, as we've heard again from other speakers who preceded me, are trying to guess at that and stay behind a line without really being quite sure where that line is in the sand. And I assume that foreign companies will be trying to do the same thing without maybe as much intuitive understanding of unspoken rules. Does that answer your question sufficiently?
I'm looking at the listing that we were given this morning under your presentation on rags to riches. Good corporate citizen, pay your taxes, be politically correct, be sensible about your license. This is good advice for doing business anywhere, not just in Russia.
Certainly, it's good advice for doing business anywhere. But I think on the tax front, a number of companies have taken kind of a proactive stance to paying taxes now beyond what appears to be a legally minimum requirement. And I think, I think companies, whether they're Russian or American, are still trying hard to figure out what the rules are. And as the rules become clearer, I think foreign companies as well as Russian companies will find it easier to try to plan a strategy that meets the needs of the Russian government in terms of foreign investment. Once they understand maybe a little bit more what those rules are and what those needs are, I think that they will be able to become more active in trying to court that once they understand that.
I think there's also, though, this concern that springs to mind because of things that people have said, and even Candy in your talk, when you mentioned the concern about how the UCOS assets are evaluated before they're sold off. If the conception in Russia now is going to be that no one's going to come in and buy a controlling share or do a JV or come in and take a giant part of an oil field, but what we're going to do is take 10% stake in an existing Russian enterprise. Then the whole question of minority shareholder rights and how assets are manipulated and resold by the federal government if there is a problem or dispute over a license or a dispute over a tax bill or so forth is highly significant. because I can come in, I can pay my taxes on time, I can be a faithful partner in terms of technology, I can make sure I pick a chairman to partner with that's gonna stay out of politics, I can do all those things. But if there's gonna be a redistribution of assets because of some kind of political shift inside the federal government, and you're gonna have assets get sold off in some kind of a shuffle or a merger, and the American company that owns 9% is gonna get 10 cents on the dollar, then that's not a very appealing, place to go and operate. So I think fundamentally, what you said really holds, is, when these assets are resold, whether it's the retendering of properties, or what BP, do they get a stake in some field in the Barents Sea in exchange for giving up property in Kvitka? I mean, the question's gonna be, do I get 10 cents on the dollar, or do I get $1 on the dollar? And I think that that's what the Western companies need to be looking at, and that's what the Russian government needs to be thinking about in terms of keeping engagement in the sector, to the extent, after Dr. Gordon's presentation, I'm not sure they want it, but to the extent that that's useful for some companies, then I think that that could be really a critical issue for the investment community. If I put $1 in, and do I keep my shareholder value? And if I can't, or if I could, what do I have to do to defend my minority shareholder right?
As usual, Amy has said it much more eloquently and articulately than I could. Thank you. I think that goes to your question as well. Again, what are foreign companies considering as they look at UCOS? It certainly has a lot of implications. Are there any more questions?
In the context of international, allowing or helping Russian companies to internationalize, whether that in fact will be a way that helps, ultimately helps foreign companies to get into the upstream in Russia, is if you let the Russians out first onto the international arena. Do you think that the West Kerner element of the Conoco-Lukoil deal, do you think that was of greater benefit to Lukoil or to Conoco? Or do you think it's like 50-50?
Well, I think I'd be speculating on trying to assign percentages. It appears from the outside, I think I have a colleague here from ConocoPhillips who might shed more light on that. It appears certainly to have been a factor in the calculation, the more ephemeral calculations about what that could bring.
Yeah.
But the Iraqis are going to make a decision about that and who gets the access. But clearly the look to be able to leapfrog, to build on that kind of relationship into global investments, I would think has been a factor there, and it's probably going to be a factor in any further deals that get done. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, well, no session on Russia or the FSU would be complete without a panel on pipelines. We've been fooling around with the pipeline question here at the Baker Institute since 1997, and I'm pleased to say that Isabel Gorst and Nina Pusenkova have been helping us decipher that question since 1997. So Isa, if you would come up. Isabel is the Russian editor with Platts Oilgram News, which is owned by McGraw-Hill. And then also we'll have a presentation by Dr. Nordari Simonia, who is the director of the Institute for World Economy and International Relations at the Russian Academy of Science.
Okay, hello everybody. I'd like to first of all begin by thanking Petroleum Center, Energy Center of Japan, and also Baker Institute, and particularly Amy, who's an old colleague and friend of mine, for inviting me to speak at this prestigious seminar. I guess you've got a copy of my paper from outside, or you can have, so I just make a few comments on certain points, and then maybe we can talk about it afterwards in question time. The paper is about the relationship or the impact of business and politics on the policies of Transneft. And I think it'd be fair to say at the moment, if you look at what Transneft's doing or being told to do by the government, as it is totally state-controlled, politics is coming out on top of business. It's interesting as Transneft at the moment has got the most superb business opportunity, growing volumes of oil going through its pipeline system, huge incentive to export with a high price, booming export business, a lot of incentive to build new pipelines to new export outlets. But it seems that for the time being, at least, politics is driving policy. I would say that that need not be particularly sinister or long-term, that energy policy, as we've been discussing, Martha Alcott particularly was discussing, is evolving in Russia, building blocks being put in place. Transneft is a key building block of the new policy. And the main, as the oil industry, the upstream part of the industry, is very largely privatized now. Transneft is the main agent of government control. I also just want to say something Mr. Weinstock, always president of Transneft, always stresses when he gives his lengthy meetings with the press, that Transneft is not an initiator of state policy, it's an executive. It's doing basically what it's told, and it's very competent at that. Moving along, Transneft is under quite a lot of attack, particularly from international commentators and also more quietly from Russian producers for just not keeping up with the game, not bringing on enough export capacity to cope with the extra production and the extra exports. And it manages somehow to defend itself by stressing constantly that actually it has got more room in its system than the producers are prepared, have got enough oil to fill. There was only last Tuesday a conference with Mr. Weinstock when he said that there was spare capacity in the system. Production is rising less fast than expected. In a way, that's academic. Who's to blame? Fact is that oil production the growth in oil production, which has been very rapid, is slowing slightly. Transneft is bringing new capacity on stream, partly by debottlenecking. It's had big success with its new Baltic pipeline, which initially was going to start it out as being quite a modest project. In the last 2 years, it's built up a 1 million barrel a day export outlet to Primorsk near St. Petersburg. It's hoping to get government permission to boost it further to 1.2, 1.3 million barrels a day. That's a huge new Russian oil stream going into northwest Europe. Also now, you found a complete reconfiguration of the way, thanks to that project, Russian oil exports are flowing. Instead of before, Novorossiysk on the Black Sea was the main marine terminal. Now Primorsk has actually this year overtaken Novorossiysk. It's a big shift. In a way, I think the Baltic system was originally designed for political reasons, strategic political reasons, to provide Russia with a major export outlet that did not cross any foreign state. It's noticeable that as soon as that pipeline came on stream, Transneft cut off exports via Ventspils, which is a pipeline going through Latvia to the Baltic. But now, of course, although Primorsk has got some disadvantages because of winter icing, it doesn't have such a severe bottlenecking problem as does Novorossiysk, which has to, all the oil moving out from the Black Sea has to go through the Bosphorus. I'll come on to talk about bottlenecks later, in the transit context. The key decisions, in a way we should have this seminar again next year when some of the key decisions about the routing of exports have been made, because it's still very much in the balance where, how, when, and the funding of new export routes will be built out of Russia. I think probably most of you here are familiar with the proposed routes, and the discussion's been going on now for more than a year. Will we build a pipeline to Nakhodka or to Daqing in China? The main arguments being there, Nakhodka is longer, more expensive, more challenging, but it would serve a much wider range of customers, or could serve a wider range of buyers than a pipeline that was end-stopped in China. Then looking to Western routes, the oil companies led by Mr. Khodorkovsky were very much in favor of building a pipeline to Murmansk, which would serve the US market. Transneft at first really poo-pooed that project, has now seems to have come round more to the idea of building a Western pipeline from Surgut out of West Siberia, but wants to build it to Indika closer to Siberia to cut costs. Doesn't like the idea of going to Murmansk. Is also making pretty cynical remarks about the potential of the US market. I think that's probably politics more than business. I think the US could take more Russian oil if it's not for Mr. Weinstock to decide that anyway. Other projects which Transneft is looking at are to bypass the Bosphorus, which is very badly choked with tankers, and also possibly to build a pipeline across Bulgaria to the Aegean. Both those are going rather badly. It just reinforces Transneft's dislike of putting pipelines or trying to organize transport across foreign states. I think that something to be borne in mind, which Martha touched upon in her piece, is that the key decisions about routing of exports, which is completely crucial to how Russia's role on international markets plays out, in the next decade is how it first of all organizes its relations with CIS producers, particularly Kazakhstan. Kazakhstan, you're seeing a very impressive oil boom, largely funded by foreign investors. In fact, still now, there's new decisions being made. All pipeline exports out of Kazakhstan are going through Russian territory. Admittedly, quite a large proportion now through the Caspian Pipeline Consortium's pipeline, which is 50% privately owned, but it still crosses Russian territory. Kazakhs took the bold step in September of beginning with CNPC of China to build a pipeline out of central Kazakhstan to the Chinese frontier. That should be finished by the beginning of 2006, not very long to wait in oil industry terms. The Russians reacted on a sort of diplomatic front fairly sharply. Mr. Christianko turned up at the inauguration. Notably, President of Kazakhstan did not turn up and said he didn't want to see any more surprises. A week after, Prime Minister Fradkov went to Astana, met with President Nazarbayev and started to discuss openly a question which I think has actually been under discussion for quite some months, the possibility of forming a Russian-Kazakh oil balance, which I think probably is about as intimate you can get in the oil industry. It means uniting your export production plans. This would have quite a lot of implications for Putin's plan or Putin's ambition, if such an ambition really does exist, to create a sort of Russia as a rival to Riyadh in terms of Saudi Arabia, in terms of a major oil producer or as a competitor to OPEC. If you think in about 10, 15 years, you'll have minimum 3 million barrels a day of oil exports coming out of Kazakhstan, probably 5 to 6 million minimum coming out of Russia. You've got 9 million barrels a day of exports, all not necessarily all going through Russia, but all being the directions, pricing, policies, all being discussed by a sort of unified Kazakh-Russian body. It's quite a big political business force on the world stage. But that's all in the making, as most things in Russian pipeline policy. I think one of another key uncertainty, which should, I hope, be decided, people say by the end of the year, but certainly within a year, is whether or not will throw its lot in with BTC, pipeline Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan, which would give it another non-Russian route to market. That's something that the Russians are not very keen to see, a loss of control. Azerbaijan has already completely, from the very start, thanks largely to investment by BP, managed to get all its oil exports, or virtually all its oil exports, going through non-Russian routes. I think it could be said that in recent months, as Candy was mentioning, that the Russian government, which owns 24% of CPC, has shown itself more willing to or more open to the idea of expanding CPC. Until recently, it's been very resistant to that for all kinds of reasons. I think if by the CPC are hoping that by the end of the year they'll get go-ahead, which means 100% agreement from all shareholders in CPC, so Russia can easily block that project. Get go ahead to expand it from what is now a 28 million ton a year system to 67 million ton a year system. That's a huge difference and would sop up a lot of Kazakhstan's extra exports and actually some extra Russian exports. I think if you see Russia giving its go-ahead for that, that may in part be linked to some kind of, certainly some greater cooperation with the Kazakhs, maybe some modifying of the Chinese plans, the Chinese export line, or even a refusal on the part of Kazakhstan to throw its oil into the BTC system. But the key question about also undecided but being discussed fairly energetically now in Moscow is it's all very well having all these export plans. Who's going to pay for it if you're not going to allow private investment? I think private investment will. I mean, Putin actually said in his address to the nation on May 26 that he could see a role for private investment. He didn't quite say what he saw the role as. I think that the Russian government and Transneft will be open to private investment in pipelines, but not on the kind of terms that foreign investors usually look for, which is, first of all, equity, secondly, access rights, guaranteed access rights, and also Western firms very understandably want quality banking. But it may be, it depends really, a lot will be decided there is what the oil price is, how desperate people are to get pipelines so that their upstream projects can fly. At the moment, the boot seems to be very much on Russia's foot, as it used to be. In the 90s, you'd find foreign companies coming in and say, we'll invest in your oil fields, but you want PSAs, you want 100% access rights, you want this and that, and not many deals got signed. There's now, since September 11th, been a feeling that companies are just desperately looking for reserves, and the people offering the reserves, the countries offering the reserves, tend to be places where the industry is dominated by the state, are tightening up the terms, making it much tougher to get in, because they feel they can sort of adopt a love my oil, love my terms approach to investors. Kazakhstan certainly is making much, much tougher terms in the offshore, and the Caspian offshore is probably one of the most desirable oil plays in the world. But it's only going to be desirable as long as oil prices stay pretty high, which is a sort of billion-dollar question. Will these tough terms be a brake on investment? Maybe, as I've said, it depends on the term. I'd just like to address Mr. Rich Gordon's remark that Transneft is sort of like a relic from the past and looks very like a sort of Soviet dinosaur to some Western observers. I think Rich has got a point, but it should be borne in mind that Transneft is very competent at what it does, which wasn't always a word associated with Soviet organizations. Also, if, as Mark pointed out, or speculated, I haven't heard anyone in Moscow talking about this, but it is possible that Transneft will be expanded to also run gas pipelines. No one quite knows what's going to happen to Gazprom yet, but there's consistently been discussion about splitting away the transport, which means pipeline elements of Gazprom's business. You could see a situation when gas and oil pipelines were put into one organization, which is the Kazakh model, actually. If that happens, and you compare the way Gazprom runs its pipelines with the way Transneft runs the pipelines, Transneft just looks like a paradise. And with Gazprom, you've got no transparency, no access guarantees. We don't even really know there's different fees for independents than from Gazprom. You don't know what Gazprom pays, you don't know what it costs, you don't even know where the capacity is. So I think you could see a big opportunity for reform of the whole transport business if you've got the whole lot thrown in together. So I'd like to finish there. Welcome to any questions.
Yeah, I think we'll take the questions after Dr. Sanders.
My short speech. Well, thank you, Amy, and thank you, Institute of Rice, inviting me. It's my first visit, and I knew only from my friends information about your institute and serious job you are doing in the field of research on oil projects. And you invited me to participate in your future publications. So my chapter is on the Eastern Siberia oil and gas problems. And today I am going to join Isabel on pipeline topic, because if I read whole my paper, it takes 2 hours or more. So I will just take part of this, my paper. What I wanted to say today, listening all these interesting presentations and questions and answers, the problem of pipeline in Eastern Siberia is a very serious economic and political problem. Even I can say geo-economic and geopolitical problem for Russia. The Eastern Siberia was like a colony, Eastern Siberia and Far East too, like a colony for the rest of Russia. And I spent a lot of time and my energy as a member of the Scientific Council of Security Council since mid of 90s, trying to persuade my government that they must change something in this region, that this is very serious place, and this is a field where some kind of breakthrough in our relations with Asia-Pacific countries can be made. And, you know, the permanent answer was, because at that time the member of this council was also first deputy economy minister and then minister of economy of Russia, Mr. Urinson, who is now working with Chubais. And he always answered me immediately after my paper presentation on this scientific council. Oh, no, 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 we have in Russia 89 subjects of federation, and we must treat them equally. All my efforts to explain that it is something specific you cannot treat equally because it needs some special efforts, special strategy for this region, simply was ignored. Only after Putin came to power, there was adequate attention paid to this. Putin visited several times Eastern Siberia. There was even a session of Academy of Science in Novosibirsk, special session. All Presidium, that time I was member of Presidium of Academy of Science, went to Novosibirsk, and Putin came, made a speech, and listening our speeches, he made a task to work out some strategy for development of Eastern Siberia and Far East of Russia. And in a year, such a strategy was prepared, sent to Moscow, but then we found out that we, in executive power, we have double layers. One is presented by Putin and his administration, and second by Kasyanov and his government. It was not the same, you know. It was absolutely different layers, and sometimes contradicting, sometimes not openly, but contradicting each other. And practically, they buried this project prepared by Academy of Science with the help of the regional governors in Siberia, and practically no realization of this project happened later on. I am telling this because there's permanent struggle going on inside Russia, and not only between business and executive power, but inside executive power itself, and between executive power and legislative power also, because previous Duma practically was bought by our Russian oligarchs. And in one of my visits to Washington, one very serious politician, not scholar, politician, showed me the paper. He said, you see, this is the names of deputies and their prices. How much you must pay to each deputy to achieve the task you want to achieve. So it was a reality, sad reality. Of course, a country cannot survive in that kind of conditions. And it was inevitable, the changes which Putin started. Practically, he was preparing these changes before Beslan tragedy, but Beslan tragedy was just a stimulus to make it faster and immediate. But it was a objective necessity to consolidate power in Russia. People are talking about back movement from democracy. And even before Putin asked such a question, I was asking always this question asking my friends, how it's possible to retreat from something which never existed. During the Yeltsin's time, there was anarchy, there was weak authoritarian regime, practically paralyzed regime, and weak president, with weak possibility to think and to make decisions, working on documents permanently on dacha near Moscow and drinking vodka. How it was possible to call this kind of system a democracy? It's only people sitting in offices here maybe can imagine that kind of democracy, but we never feel that we are living in a democratic country, never. And just a small group of people around new Russian oligarchs who had their own democracy, club, I called it club democracy, gathering every week, each other drinking and showing to us on TV how they are drinking, how they are enjoying valuable things, how are they traveling all around the globe, and that kind of stuff. This is their democracy. And it was, of course, changed now to authoritarian regime of development. I call it's my term. I am using that kind of term. That it is also authoritarian regime like it was before, but it is consolidated regime and devoted to development, economic development of Russia. Because without stability, there is no democracy. First, economic development, and then the whole history of mankind shows us. You cannot point any country in European history or in Asian history which achieved democracy without economic development. And the order was such that there was first economic, take South Korea, 30 years of dictatorship, Korean miracle, they achieved some level of development, middle class emerged, came to the streets, fight for democracy, and then democracy came. It was not brought as a gift from outside to the country, but it was fought by themselves, by the people who became able to fight on the streets for this democracy. And in Russia, we said that why we must do some efforts. There is a nice bicycle in the West. We just can borrow this bicycle, and it's not necessary for us to start from the very beginning, and we can jump into democracy, into development stage, and now we are in ruins, and now we are trying to consolidate and to develop the country. This is a kind of introductory explanation. Now about pipeline. This pipeline from Nakhodka and now from to Nakhodka and the pipeline to Datsun, there was competition early, I remember it is in 1998, the idea of Transneft and to build the pipeline to Nakhodka, and the Yukos and Khodorkovsky that time was on the side of this project. But after one of meetings of Russian-Chinese Commission, when it was decided that there will be cooperation in energy sphere, Khodorkovsky decided to change his mind, and he immediately jumped to this opportunity, and he made a private agreement with Chinese oil company. And when he managed, using his friendship with Mr. Kasyanov, managed to sign an agreement in Beijing in the presence of Kasyanov and Zhu Rongji, which was that time Prime Minister of China. Later on, Chinese were insisting, we signed an agreement. And we always trying to explain to them, no, we as a state, we never signed an agreement. It was agreement between corporations. So we are not responsible for that kind of agreement. So Chinese now finally understood. And it was explained to China that Yukos is not Russia. It is part of Russia, but it is not the whole Russia. And Chinese behaved as if Siberia is really their territory. Of course, if you take textbooks, school textbooks, you can find the maps in China that shows the major part of Siberia as a territory which was taken from them by Russian Tsars. And now they are saying that they are not pretending on our territory, but we know that at least four four generations of Chinese are taught by such textbooks, and so it's in their heads and brains that there was injustice made in many centuries ago to them, and nobody knows. Now China is peaceful, but what happens after 20 years or 25 or 30 years when China becomes maybe a major power of the world, superpower, what will happen then? So when we are deciding what kind of pipeline we need, pipeline to Datsun or pipeline to Nakhotka, we are taking into consideration our relations with China. By the way, Isabel mentioned already that if pipeline will go to Nakhotka, then we can sell it to everybody, practically to China, to Taiwan, to Japan, to South Korea, to United States, if you like. But if we are building Datsun, pipeline gas Datsun, then we are dependent on China, like it happened with Turkey. We built a gas pipeline to Turkey, spent nearly $3 billion, and next day, then pipeline was finished, they said, no, this agreement is not good for us. We demand less, price must be less, amount of gas must be less, or if we take all gas which is written in agreement, then you must allow us to resell this gas at our own price to third countries. So we doesn't want to be dependent on China in the same situation. And this was one reason why, for example, I published several articles on this topic, and I said openly that we must not fall into a trap of depending on any country, friendly or not friendly. Second consideration, my PhD dissertation, which was translated in early 60s in Cornell University, was on economic role of Chinese minority in Southeast Asia. And I know very well how peacefully Chinese penetrated all Southeast Asian countries and now are dominating their economies. Practically Chinese minority called Huaqiao, they are in key industries and financial sphere of all Southeast Asian countries. So it's much easier for them. That time, in medieval time, emperors of China were resisting to such contacts. It was prohibited, and it was punished. People were punished for making contact with South. But here, in our case, Siberia is practically open for Chinese migration. There are, of course, borders, there are, of course, customs, everything, but taking into account one more serious characteristic of our society, that unlike Western countries, unlike Japan, unlike South Korea, corruption in my country is different. People are saying, what's different? Corruption is everywhere. In the United States, there was an Enron case and many others. Okay, my answer is, in my country, corruption is way of life. Practically everything and everybody is involved in corruption. This is a big problem. And it cannot be solved one day and by one stroke overnight. It takes maybe 2 decades to change the situation. Putin is trying to do something, but of course we must judge his results not today, but maybe after several years, after end of his second term. And this is a big obstacle because Chinese are bribing practically everybody in Siberia and penetrating very easily. They are coming as a tourist and they're staying. And at the same time, the Russian population is decreasing in these regions. Every year decreasing. Tens of thousands of people are living in these places because, as I told you, it was like a colony, and it still is like a colony. No attention paid, suffering, huge resources, energy resources exist there, but they are always suffering when winter comes, and you know that it is very harsh climate in this territory. They are always suffering because there is no heat and nothing. And such a situation is very dangerous because just one example, which shows how dangerous and how huge is corruption in our economic relations with China. Practically 75% of timber export to China is illegal. 75% of it's huge amount of timber illegal. It's not a small matches you put into your pocket and go outside the country. So you can imagine what kind of serious problem this is. Then there are economic considerations too. Not only that in Nakhotka many other countries can join, but for Siberia region, it is very important because Angars Datsun, only one subject of federation is involved. And if you go to Nakhotka, then at least 6 oblast and krai, we call it, such administrative regions in Russia, are benefiting from this social economic development. Then comes the problem of how to finance, because when it was, some people were insisting on Nakhotka project, Khodorkovsky was saying, where is the money? Because it needs a lot of money. And in my case, I can spend money, and China is going to spend money to construct the pipeline on the Chinese side of border. So this time, Japan came to the scene. In the end of 2002, Japanese government, especially MITI and Ministry of Foreign Affairs, they sent a letter proposing to Russia, Russian government, that they can give untied loan, it's unusual thing, untied loan, $5 billion for construction of this pipeline, and then they can also invest in development of some oil fields in eastern Siberia, at least $2 billion. That time, there was many Japanese business people coming to Moscow. Some of them visited my office, including the representatives of, that time it was called Exim, Japan Exim Bank, now it's called different, Bank of International Cooperation. And they were asking some advices, and I told them, in Russia, if you want success, you must not deal on local level or on the level of corporations, but you must, your prime minister must deal on the level of president. If president will decide, then there is a big chance of success. Otherwise, everything will disappear on the level of government, in the ministries, our bureaucracy, which are just looking into your hands. Are there money, are there dollars or not? If not, not. They are not interested in any project. And so practically, when Koizumi came to, in January 2003, he formulated all these ideas about Nakhotka pipeline and proposal of financial participation of Japan in developing pipeline and also in oil and gas business. And Putin responded adequately, but still, as I mentioned, there was a double layer of decision-making. When some paper comes with Putin's signature to the level of government, then government starts pretending to be engaged in reacting on this resolution, but in reality, the result of discussion on the level of government was such a Solomon decision. They decided that they are going to join 2 projects, one to Datsun, one to Nakhotka, in one project. But first, it must be built to Datsun, and then later on, that means that it was a kind of diplomatic decision, which was in favor of Yukos and China, of course. And of course, Khodorkovsky was happy. I saw next day his face on TV. saying that this is a mudre решение, very wise decision, and he decided that he is winner. And but the problem is that at that time, practically new energy strategy was appearing, not just already formulated by appearing precisely in Eastern Siberia. This beginning of this new strategy was the letter which Gazprom and Rosneft sent to Putin, proposing in this letter to develop Eastern Asia energy resources by one strategical plan design. That doesn't mean that private business will not be allowed to do business. More than this, they underlined that it is very important to involve all kinds of private investment. But then Surgutneftegas several months later joined them. So there was a kind of conglomerate of three companies. And they had some problems, of course, even between themselves. Because Gazprom, I say frankly, my personal opinion, though I was working 2 years advising something to Gazprom, but this is still typical Soviet organization. And very conservative, very bureaucratic, and of course very selfish one. So in respect of very nice words that they are working in the interest of Russian economy and Russian people and so on, they are caring first of all about their corporate interests, and practically it is a major obstacle to success of new strategy in this region. Why? Because they look at the problems of Eastern Siberia from their selfish interests, first of all. Recently, one of the vice presidents of Gazprom, Mr. Ananenkov, several times visited Siberia, and he said that this big project of Kavikta, it is not oil, it's gas project, is Kavikta, well, we will develop Kavikta, but we will not export the gas to China or to Japan, to South Korea, but we will export this Eastern Siberian gas, we will export to the West. It's quite understandable. Their interests, first of all, is concentrated in the Western countries, European countries, and they have some difficulties now because there is necessary to make huge investment in new projects to keep the promises to provide more and more gas to European countries. And so they decided to do this at the expense of Eastern Siberian gas fields, and it was ridiculous. I immediately sent a letter to Mr. Medvedev, who you know he's a head of President's administration, and at the same time he's a chairman of Council of Directors of Gazprom, and tried to explain to him that it is disaster. This Kavikta gas is necessary for Russia to make one more breakthrough in Asia Pacific, and not to solve the problems of Gazprom itself. And I don't know what was the impact of my two letters, but at least I am satisfied now that E.ON, this huge energy corporation of Germany and maybe biggest in Europe, because they swallowed Rurgas, it was friendly merger. So E.ON finally decided, changed their mind, came to Moscow in July this year, and decided that they are going to build pipeline from Stockman gas field, which is huge one, but one of the more difficult gas fields, because it is not on the land, but it is offshore, at that northern part of offshore, Russian offshore. And, but they signed already general agreement, framework agreement, but it was not like before that framework agreement is signed, but then everybody forget about this. Just 2 weeks later, there was created a joint commission, working commission. They are really working on this project. And it's not only a project to dig and to get the gas, but also to build a pipeline in Baltic Sea and also to build several electric stations. So now Gazprom is approaching to model of EU countries that they are merging two businesses, gas business and electricity business. They are merging into one, and this provides them bigger efficiency in energy sphere. I think that this is a normal solution because it can solve Gazprom's problem, but it can solve also Russia's problems in dealing with energy in the field of energy cooperation with Western European countries. Coming back to Eastern Siberia and pipeline project, I want to say one thing. I was several times in Japan recently, and I came with mixed feelings. First of all, when I was talking with business community, and I was twice had chance to meet in the Japanese Keidanren, I hope you know, very important organization, and practically all big business is under Keidanren's supervision. And I talked even on highest level because I spent half a day with leadership of this organization, and second half of the day I spent with 110 business representatives. And I feel that they are really interested in dealing with Russia in energy sphere, in many others fields. For example, Toyota is going to build a car factory in Russia, and now it's in search of place, and all governors in Russia are fighting with each other because Kirienko wants it to be in his Novgorod, and Matvienko wants to be in St. Petersburg, the place of the... but at least now it's absolutely different atmosphere. People are saying in our liberal newspapers that because of UCOS, there is practically Russia lost the interest of foreign companies, but it is absolutely different situation. If you take not just propaganda things, but concrete facts, and I always answering in Japan. Just in July, I was in August. My first visit this year was in August. Later on, I was recently. And I'm telling, look, UCOS is UCOS, but at the same time, only in 1 month, in July, several big corporations, especially energy corporations, came to Moscow to discuss the investment problems. ConocoPhillips decided to come and to discuss how to spend $5 to $10 billion during several years in the energy sector of Russia. And then I mentioned already E.ON agreement also in July. Then several times people mentioned deal with Lukoil and ConocoPhillips. And there are 2 or 3 more. Especially I am glad to read news about Exxon Mobil, because you know that Exxon was twice defeated. Once it was defeated in its attempt to deal with Khodorkovsky to buy 40% of joint corporation, not only UCOS, but at that time it was a process of finishing merger of UCOS with Sibneft, and it was 40% of both of these companies. And it's interesting that I'm not going to name him, but one of my, it's not friend, but we know each other very well, correspondent of New York Times, was sitting in my office and discussing this proposal to acquire this 40%, he has said, no, Dari, I can't understand. If one Chinese company will come to United States and wants to buy 40% of Exxon, the whole administration will be on its ears. And why the people are so amazed that Russia is refusing to sell this kind of equity to foreign company. I can frankly tell you that I was told by a very high-level administration man, he told me that since deal between British Petroleum and TNK, and you know that it was signed in London, and there was President Tony Blair and Vladimir Putin, and there was a huge propaganda in all newspapers that it is the biggest investment in Russia, biggest investment. And everybody was thinking that it is real investment in Russia. But it was not FDI. Putin is always happy. Okay, I'm finishing with this story. Putin is always saying that he is greeting any real FDI investment. Foreign direct investment is necessary for Russia, and we are in favor of this, but this merger was not FDI. It was not FDI because British Petroleum paid to Mr. Friedman and Owen, and they put 3 billion pounds in their pockets, and that's it. Russia got nothing and lost control of a big Russian property. And then now, recently, when this joint company wanted to do some business, acquiring some property in Germany, and BP had share in this property, then British Petroleum prohibited this. So this is that kind of friendship and partnership. And Putin was furious. I was told that Putin, after knowing all these things, he became furious. He understood that he was cheated about this huge investment in Russia. So that's why his reaction on Exxon's proposal to acquire 40% of that. Well, I was told that I must finish. Thank you.
Okay, we have a few minutes for questions. Do we have any questions from the audience? No questions.
Got
Yeah,
one.
Bob?
In a way, when you look at East Siberia oil and gas, the natural market, of course, among others, is China. When the United States look north, we see Canada. And Canada is, of course, our number one supplier of oil. When China looks north, it sees eastern Siberia. But I think we have to be a little cautious about the future of China and its economic growth and its demand for energy. If you look at all of the obstacles facing that country, the mass migration of people from rural to urban, from the farm to the city, has been characterized as one of the greatest mass migrations in history. Second, problem with water, adequate water supplies. Third, is China going to be able to feed itself? And fourth, and probably the most severe of the problems is when we ask the question, is China going to grow old before it grows rich? Because it has an aging population. So you lump all these factors together, and it somewhat clouds the future of China as, for energy demand to continue to grow as it has in the past.
Anybody else? Okay, well, we'll move on to our next session, which is on the impact of Russian oil and gas on international markets.